Well, hi there, it's Mr. Bleeker again. Now that we've finished our analysis of the reproductive system, we're going to move into Chapter 16, the excretory system. Now, don't let the picture fool you. The excretory system is a lot more than what you're seeing here. This is the urinary system. But there are other organs and tissues that are also a part of the excretory system. For example, when you release carbon dioxide out of your lungs, they're an excretory organ. If you've ever seen sweat stains on a white shirt, not a pleasant thought, but those are excretions from the skin. We have excretions from our liver, from our large intestine. But for the purposes of chapter 16, we'll focus in on the excretory organs of the urinary system, specifically the kidneys, and we'll look at those as ultrafiltration organs, which is what they really are. And we'll examine how they filter waste products from the blood and how they return some of the good things that they filtered by accident, and how they ensure that the bad things that they wanted to eliminate are expelled from the body. So we've got a lot to talk about. We'll start with an overview. So here we go. Okay. So we'll have a little bit of fun with this. So really what it's all about when you talk about excretion, it's the body releasing its metabolic wastes. When you think about the lungs, for example, the natural waste product coming out of your lungs is carbon dioxide. But there also is a little bit more of a waste product there. On a cold winter day, you'll see the other waste product, which is water. And if you think about the function of mitochondria, for example, in our earlier chapters, um, anytime you burn a hydrocarbon, you'll get carbon dioxide and you'll get water as waste products. So, let's turn this down a little bit. That'll do. So it's all about eliminating metabolic waste products. They should be expelled and eliminated from the body. It's important to do that because you want to maintain homeostasis. For example, you can't let your blood sugar get too low. You need to maintain that. For example, that's homeostasis. And if you get waste products building up and toxins building up in your blood, those have to be removed. Otherwise, you get into a state where you're in tremendous imbalance. And if you can't eliminate the waste from your blood, for example, that is potentially fatal. You might have heard of hemodialysis or dialysis machines, and that's something that people whose kidneys aren't functioning properly are put on, but that's not a permanent solution. Really, if your kidneys do fail, you would be lining up for an organ donation. But there's all sorts of good things that we want to make sure that we don't lose when we do ultrafiltration. Like, for example, if you're wandering around in the desert and your kidneys are busy filtering water, well, how do you get a little bit of that back? There's situations where you shouldn't be eliminating some things. During the overall course of getting rid of waste products, you do lose some good things. Water, glucose is another one. It can be filtered right out along with your waste products. It's extremely small. There's amino acids like glucose. They're quite tiny, and they need to be returned to the blood. So this is a little bit of conservation. And conservation has to be in balance, or has to be in balance with elimination. Okay. So let's look at a few of the nasty wastes that need to be eliminated from the body. I've said since the beginning of the course, if you consume anything that's protein based, you want to consider the fundamental structure of an amino acid. Now, an amino acid will always have the amino group, and I'll just draw a simple one here. See if I can get that to go. There we go. There. So a fundamental amino acid will always have the amino group here, and of course this is the acidic or the carboxyl group on the end. Now this becomes quite important to pay attention to. Now if you look at that, you say, okay, if all I had to eat, for example, was meat, what remains of the rest of the molecule? If you eliminate this amino group right here, what you have remaining really is a hydrocarbon. Carbon chains, lots of hydrogen attached, you get the idea. And if you eliminate the NH or the amino group, it's not long until your NH2, your amine group, becomes something ammonia like NH3, and heaven forbid, NH4 ammonium. Now, if you know your chemistry, those are very strong bases. So as you consume protein, you think of your blood chemistry. If it wasn't corrected for, if these waste products from amino acid metabolism aren't removed, you have a very strong base forming in your blood. Okay, now think about it this way. You wouldn't want bleach or sudsy ammonia floating around in your blood. You would realize that would be super toxic and you wouldn't survive. So this buildup of ammonia has to be eliminated. And what happens is, in a trip to your liver, ammonia gets eliminated by converting it to something that we call urea. So, what is that? Well, there's a lot of carbon dioxide floating around in your tissues. It's a prevalent waste product from burning hydrocarbons. So, we've got a lot of carbon dioxide and a lot of ammonia. And if we put those together, we can form a substance called urea. It's a neat way of locking away ammonia in concert with carbon dioxide and then eliminating it from the body. Now, you really want to eliminate that from the body. Urea goes in its liquid form is what we call urine. So that yellow stuff in your pee, for example, we'll talk about the color reason why pee is yellow. But one of the main components in your urine is basically urea. It's just in a really dilute form. Now, you do secrete urea from your skin as well. That's much more concentrated, and when you're active, you could feel it stinging your eyes. If you ever get sweat in your eyes, you're getting a waste product in your eyes, and it's kind of salty, and it sort of burns and stings the eyes. I know, what a pleasant thought, right? Now, if urea isn't eliminated from the blood, you can get the formation of these crystals. Urea itself will crystallize. It's, like I said, it's a bit of a salt. And if it crystallizes in the joints, you can get gout. So let's take a quick spin here and we'll look at urea. I just want to show you an image of that. And then we'll look at the symptoms of gout. So urea itself is pretty simple. There you go. So you can see how you're locking away the amino group and with carbon dioxide. You can see this trick here. It's not really that complicated of a molecule. Two amino groups and double bonded carbon to oxygen. Pretty simple. Pretty straightforward. Now, if you look at what happens with gout, if you can't release urea effectively from the body, what you'll start to get is you'll get a buildup of these little crystals, these uric acid crystals, and they build up on the joints, and it starts to form an inflammation, and it becomes very sharp-like. And people who have gout, they'll walk with crutches. They'll find it very difficult to get around because of the crystals forming around the saddle of the joints and whatnot. Now, what can precipitate something like this, for example, I've had Family members who say they can't eat shellfish, that'll bring it on. Eating too much protein when you already have a problem eliminating urea and uric acid from the blood. Red dye number six, which you see in a lot of soft drinks. Red dye number six gives Coca Cola its brown appearance, which is ironic because when you think about it, it's supposed to be brown, but it's red dye number six. It's just what you're seeing when you look through the dye. It's actually kind of red. Now, red dye number six can aggravate a condition like this. So, what you do in a case like this, if someone has difficulty uh, in eliminating urea from the body, probably the best thing to do is put them on a low protein diet because the body's having difficulty eliminating basically the NH2 group from the protein. The amino group is suspect, it's a problem. So, yes, gout can be very, very painful. There's another product that's a nitrogenous you probably haven't heard of, but it's called creatinine. Now, this is for you. You might have heard of creatine monophosphate. It was kind of all the rage in the 1990s and sort of the early millennium, and it's an energy compound. And let's show you that right here. Bodybuilders, for example, were taking this compound called um, creatinine monophosphate. And what it does is it has a little bit of phosphorus attached to it. Turns out that this molecule is really good at dishing off a little extra phosphate to recharge ATP. This is an interesting molecule because it's present in basically in your brain. It's also present in your muscles. And if you think about it, those are two areas where quick energy is really going to be needed. When you're taking a really tough test or when you're running a race, ATP could really use a recharge. And this stuff is quite prevalent in the tissues, this phosphocreatinine, phosphocreatine, I should say. So what happens when it loses its high energy phosphate is it becomes a molecule that has to be eliminated. So you can think of it as muscle poop. It's really not that far off. So it's another nitrogenous waste that gets produced from breaking down creatine phosphate in your muscles. So you have to really get rid of this nitrogenous waste, or well, you'll be all out of balance. So there we go. Get rid of those nitrogenous wastes. Take a look at the list 1 through 4. You do need to know those. Okay, so from ammonia to urea to uric acid to creatinine. Okay, make a note. Now, there's other waste products you want to eliminate from the body. Excess amounts of water, right? If you think about it, our mitochondria are sort of running all the time, and they're like gas-powered generators. They're running on a hydrocarbon, and they're producing a lot of water. And that water needs to be eliminated from the body. If you don't eliminate, if you put too much water in the blood, you'll get what's called hypertension, right? Too much water in the pipes. Hypertension is also known as high blood pressure, right? So that can take you above the recommended 120 over 80. You've probably heard about that number. So let's keep the water under control. Now, there's also salts and anything that isn't an acid or a base. But the most common one, the one that you'd probably gear up on right away, right? Sodium, needed for proper functioning of your nerve cells. Muscles will get all jittery without it. You won't be able to control your contractions. But really, we want to make sure that our salt content of our blood, there's good old potassium, always makes me think of bananas. We want to make sure that these are in proper balance. So it becomes quite important that we have just exactly what we need, right? And they talk about that. You might have heard of electrolytes. For example, you get really sick, and I remember my daughters when they were younger, and they had been, you know, vomiting quite a bit from suffering from the flu. And one of the first things you reintroduce is something called Pedialyte, and that's just an electrolyte solution, right? And it helps to rehydrate children, get them sort of back on track, getting them back to be balanced. So you've got to maintain your salts. And we'll look at exactly how the kidney does that. Carbon dioxide, it's interesting. You always think of carbon dioxide as being something that's eliminated mainly from the lungs. But the kidneys have the ability to take a little bit of carbon dioxide and there's a little trick they can do where they combine it with water. Now, bear this trick in mind because your respiratory system relies on this trick as well, where you might think that carbon dioxide is always a gas, but in fact, we can make it into an aqueous ion. It's a reversible reaction where you can think about it like this, and we can also have kind of two forms of it. At this point, it becomes dissolved in the fluid of your blood, and it can be returned, for example, to the lungs, and you can breathe it out. It's excreted as a gas, but it hitches a ride back to your lungs as a liquid, which is neat, and that will come up again in the respiratory system. So some bile gets excreted. Now, if you know bile, that's the green sort of emulsifier that comes down from your liver, and it's used to help you digest fats. It's a very good emulsifier. But there's all sorts of things you can eliminate, right? There's bile itself is sort of a green color. So there's other pigments in there. There's a little bit of heme from blood. And you think of this sort of soup that's going to get sort of produced. You When you look at what's coming down from the gallbladder, there's a little bit extra in there. There's some waste products from blood, for example, and that's going into your small intestine. Now, if you sort of think about that, it's like, well, so bile is doing a little bit more than just emulsifying my fat. Yes, in fact, there's some things in your bile that will just be eliminated from the body. And bile is formed by the liver, so that shouldn't be a surprise. It's a filter organ. Tricky little sort of maneuver by the liver to help get rid of or some recycled old components of blood cells. So, what are the excretory organs? As I've said, you've got your skin, right? And of course, we sweat to maintain homeostasis so that we cool down. But there's a lot in sweat. Of course, the water is there to cool us down because water itself can absorb a lot of heat and conversely release a lot of heat. Salt is quite sweaty. And then there's that component right here, urea. And we'll just put a little side note. Um, if you look at sweat stains, this is where the yellow color comes from. Now, if you think back to Biology 11, we talked a little bit about organisms that excrete from their skin. Earthworms do this. If you recall, there was a term called nephridia. I'm just going to pose that for you. And I remember saying these were like little kidneys, almost like little kidney tissue that ran all the way down the earthworm, and their job was to release metabolic waste products, like urea. So we have a case in evolution for this happening. Releasing waste products from the skin is hardly new. We If you want to go back far enough, if you recall the flame cells in our little friends the planarians, they were kind of the first ones that were observed doing this sort of mechanism. So then we've got your liver. where we've already sort of talked about the bile pigments, a little bit of recycled material from blood cells there. So the liver itself has excretions that's going to release, and those will get eliminated from the body. Bile, for example, because it enters your intestine, just passes out of the body, uh, basically through the digestive system. Lungs, well, cold winter day, you'll see these being released out into the air. Well, by these, I guess I should say you'll see the water droplets. The carbon dioxide is as a result of you breaking down hydrocarbons. For example, well, here's a really simple hydrocarbon, which is glucose, which is one of the most simple and is the one they'll put in your arm if you go to the hospital. They'll insert the IV because we run very well on glucose. It's an energy molecule, but it doesn't provide everything we need. There's no amino acids or fats in that, for example. For the purpose of this chapter, we're going to focus in on the kidneys. The release, basically releasing inorganic materials such as salt and water. But the kidneys do so much more than that. Our kidneys are able to release um, other products. If you take antibiotics, they'll be eliminated by the kidneys. If you take ibuprofen, that's eliminated by the kidneys. So you might have heard that ibuprofen can be kind of tough on your kidneys. You're going to learn why in this chapter because they're an elimination organ for that kind of a substance. And of course, we're going to release, just make a little note of it, we're going to release a lot of nitrogenous waste. For example, the amino group that you'll see coming up in amino acids, proteins, of course, polypeptides. That has to be eliminated, otherwise, you get a strong base in your blood. And the blood really needs to stay around a neutral pH, so that's not really in your survival interests. So the urinary system is the one that we'll look at particularly for this chapter, for chapter 16. And here's an overview, but I'm going to give a better overview of it in a minute. Okay, your kidneys. Now this is a little bit high for my liking. The kidneys are actually located in the small of the back. In the dissections that we did in previous years, they're always kind of located. This is why they talk about kidney punches. They're located just underneath your ribs, where your ribs cease if you run your thumb down your back, and kind of at the base of the spine. And of course, they're a dorsal organ. If you recall, when we dissected, it wasn't. It didn't really matter if it was mammals or turtles or birds, for example. This bean-like organ was always found in that location. So the kidneys produce urine, which will contain all the waste products we're going to outline. The kidneys are led down by the ureters or ureters, which is this here. Which leads, of course, to the bladder, right here. Now, the bladder itself is a storage organ, and it contains smooth muscle. So when it's time to go to the bathroom, the bladder itself will it will contract to expel the urine. The bladder, as it expands, has little stretch receptors, and those little stretch receptors will send signals to the brain that you have to go to the bathroom, to the point where eventually you just will. Leading out from the body is the urethra, and that's just elimination of urine stored in the bladder. So nothing here we haven't seen before. We'll talk about a couple of these later. This is an endocrine organ. The adrenal gland kind of interesting here how it's situated on top of the kidney right there. Okay. You've heard of adrenaline. And adrenaline is, well, it's a hormone that can supercharge our metabolism. Now, it's the adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys because if you look at what the kidneys are connected to, right here, you see that the kidneys are connected to the aorta, and this is the vena cava. Now, having the adrenal glands there is pretty smart because if you want to get adrenaline into the blood very quickly, that's a great place to deposit adrenaline into two of the biggest conducting pipes um, for circulation in the body. But as I say, we'll talk more about that later. Zooming in, we've got the renal artery and the renal vein. So the renal artery, and I'm going to show an animation of this in a second. The renal artery is what leads in. So I'll just say renal artery like that. And what leads away, I'll just draw from this kidney, leading away and then going up the vena cava, that would be our renal vein. Arteries always lead away from the heart, and veins lead back to the heart. That's a definition. Don't I know there's a temptation to look at the color, right? Arteries red, full of oxygenated blood. Yep, and when I get to the pulmonary system, we'll talk about how that's reversed. The simplest definition of an artery is that it leads away from the heart. Okay? That's very important. So draw a heart up here. And that veins lead back to the heart. Okay, let's just keep a simple distinction there. All right. So that's not bad, but I think we can do one better. So I've got a neat little application here. It could take a second to really load up, but if you were going to medical school, this would be the application that you would use. It's We looked at zygotebody.com online, which is of course absolutely fabulous. Um, Now that's a free and open tool. It has a few limitations, but um, this will give me the ability to look at the organs of the urinary system in a lot more detail because I want to focus on urinary organs, specifically the kidney, as the elimination organs. Focus on this chapter really is on the kidney and not so much on the other organs, the skin, etc. But this will be a good way to look at the kidney. Okay, so here we are. Go to the body atlas. And of course, here you go. So region of use, nervous system. Kind of go through all the body systems. And the one I want to get to, here we go. So this works by pinching, and then I can sort of rotate this around. If you use 3 fingers, you can zoom in. So focus in, there you go. There's your kidney. Now you notice how it says it's the right front kidney. Now I'll tell you why. You have to consider how it is in your body. That's why it's your right kidney. We're looking at it from the back right now. There's your proof. So it's your right kidney, but when you look at it from the front, it's just backwards. So there you go. So there's your left kidney. Zoom in a little bit. These things leading out. That's actually called the renal pelvis. It's just where the ureter sort of begins, and the fluid will all flow down from there, and then you're in your ureter, sometimes called ureter. And those lead down, boys and girls, exactly the same, to the bladder. And the bladder, depends on your gender, leads out through the urethra. So there you go. And you notice with the bladder, it's made up of smooth muscle, so it's not striated like skeletal muscle. All right. Now another sort of view of the kidneys here. There you go. This one is sort of a cutaway view, and I always find this kind of fascinating. So what I have to do in systems is I have to take away the bones because they're kind of in the way. So skeletal has to go away. There we go. Close that up. So now we're just looking at the kidneys kind of floating around like this, sort of creepy. But zooming in, let's move this over. You've got that region that's blue right now. That's called the cortex of the kidney. So that's the outside layer. Now we'll talk more about this, but it secretes some hormones. Um, it's of course a protective covering for these little guys that we call the renal pyramids. So zoom in on that a little bit. And between the cortex and these little pyramids, that's where the ultrafiltration happens. And you can sort of see what look like little squiggles. And there's little tubular tissue here that we're going to learn more about. But for now, understand that this is the cortex, sort of the tough outer covering, right? Used partially for filtration. And here, these renal pyramids, this is an extremely salty region of the kidney. If you've ever actually eaten organ meat like kidney, you know that the interior of the kidney is the most salty in flavor, and there's a reason for that. It helps with water reabsorption, so bear that in mind. When water is and waste products are filtered, they lead down almost they lead down from the pyramids into these this sort of collecting ducts. They all collect into this common area, and you can see all the ducts sort of at the from the side. It gives you a better view of them. Remember, this is going throughout the kidney tissue, and that leads down here, down into the renal pelvis. So this is a collecting area, and then down into the ureter. And of course, that leads down. Oop, takes 3 fingers. Here we go to our bladder, right there. Nice. So I have to sneak out. Sorry, folks. The last one I wanted to show you is the location of the kidney. And this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. So let's again zoom out. So you can see there's the front of the skeleton. So let's take our kidneys and let's show them from the rear here. So this is why if you ever hear in boxing, you have to watch your kidney punches. If you strike the kidneys, you can cause damage, and that can lead to bleeding. That'll end up, of course, the blood will end up in the bladder. It eliminated from the body, and a sign of renal failure can be blood in the urine. Never good. I remember when I had a friend that went water sliding when we were younger, and he kind of jumped off initially, and when he came down, instead of he wanted to launch himself real fast, but he came down on his kidneys and he gave himself a little bit of kidney damage, which wasn't good. Yes, that meant peeing blood. From this view from behind, you can see there's your adrenal glands, and of course this is we're looking at this from behind, so that is the right, that is the left. But I wanted to show you it's best from this side. I wanted to show you the entry to the basically how you come into the kidneys. You come in through this is the descending aorta, so you come in through a renal artery. There's one there, and there's a renal artery, oops, right there. So that leads in. So what's kind of interesting is as the blood comes in, as you come into the kidneys, you want to be filtered. So the aorta, the descending aorta, is coming down. The descending aorta is full of all sorts of waste products, that the kidney will then take, process, and the waste products that are sent down through the ureter and subsequently out through the bladder are eliminated. So the blood that goes back right here is very, very clean. It might be oxygen depleted, but this is the cleanest blood in your body because it's just come out of the kidneys. So the renal artery is totally polluted, and the renal vein is scrubbed and clean as a whistle. Well, okay, I guess that's the best analogy I can give you, but it is late, so you have to forgive me. So it's just some fabulous views that we could look at here, but I will say that we've seen as much as we need to see there of sort of a 3D overview. There we go. Let that track again. So what we've seen are the basic organs of the urinary system. So this is the excretory system with focus on the urinary system. We've got our kidneys, which produce our urine. Okay, they're protected by a little bit of fatty tissue, right? A little bit of cushioning for the organs. Remember, the one of the functions of fat was to be a protective layer. The ureters, well, they carry that urine down to the bladder, and you need a bladder. Very hard to live without one. So the ureters themselves, if you wonder about blockages, well, you can get stones that form, and of course we'll look at that in more detail. But the muscle in the ureter is smooth, so a peristaltic contraction is like when you eat. So if you draw a tube like this, a peristaltic contraction is when a surge of something goes through the tube. I'll exaggerate it, right? And that it's like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. The muscles squeeze a volume of material and they just keep squeezing until they pass it all the way down. Now, hopefully, you don't get a stone or an obstruction here or an infection, but that's what ureters do. They just carry urine to the bladder. Bladder's job, pretty simple, store that urine. And you ever wonder about what's the maximum limit to how much your bladder could hold? Well, it varies depending on the individual, but we're talking just over half a liter here. So there comes a point where the bladder stretch receptors just send a signal to the brain. This is sort of automatic. We're talking sort of the medulla oblongata. That's that region at the back of your neck there that controls your breathing and your heart rate. Yeah, after a while, you're not really going to have a choice. You'll just go to the bathroom. So the urethra is the last little sort of journey out of the body. And it's, of course, shorter in females. Okay, very short urethra. And that's the reason why some females can get bladder infections because germs, now specifically we'll talk about germs, yeast, you find it everywhere. If you look at grapes in a store, you'll see a white coating on a lot of green grapes. And that's yeast. And yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, its Latin name, will live anywhere there is sugar. In fact, we use yeast when we make alcohol from fruit. So they, the little devils get anywhere you find a sugar source. Now inside the human body, there's some mucopolysaccharides, kind of like a sugar source, and yeast can get up through a short urethra, and they can get into the bladder, and that's a region where they kind of have something to live off of, and it's a huge problem, obviously. But we also have medications, ways of going after them. Canestin, you might have heard of that. But the urethra in females is for elimination of urine. However, in males, it serves a dual function because urethra is sort of that last tube, that last moment where sperm is eliminated from the body. So dual function. And as I mentioned, no, this fellow is not being cut. This is just a plain sort of showing this level of elevation. When you look at the ribs, these are your floating ribs here, and it's right kind of underneath your floating ribs. This is why I say you don't want to take a kidney punch, because um, that's a direct impact on the kidneys. And it's just at this level where you'll find them. Now, one question I hear a lot is how much, like, I've heard we could live off one kidney. Okay, so yeah, that's true. If you lived off one kidney, you'd have to watch your metabolism. You'd have to watch sort of your diet, because you're, now one organ is doing all the filtering of all the blood in your body, and you have about 6 pints, 6 7 pints, which is 6 to 7 liters, and that's a lot of duty for one kidney to do, or sort of a large job to perform. You could get by with about 2/3 of a kidney. Um, you would need at least that sort of filtering capacity. But you don't want to test that. Mother Nature sort of has given us 2 kidneys, because this is a big job. And if you noticed, that kidney is hooked up to one of the largest blood delivery tubes in the body, right? And this is known as the aorta. That's a lot of pressure. That's like being hooked up to a fire hose. And that pressure from the aorta gets spread out through all the kidney tissue. Sort of like I guess the analogy is sort of like a bed of nails. You wouldn't want to stand on a bed of nails, but you could lie down and spread out that pressure and all that over that great surface area. Yeah, the aorta's got a lot of blood to be filtered, and the kidneys sort of have to take that raging river and spread out all that pressure into a whole bunch of little streams. That's the way it gets done. Okay, you know what? I think I'll leave it at that. This is an introduction to the excretory system, and when next we meet, we're going to not only look at the kidney, but how that filtration works. Thanks for listening, folks, and that's it. That's another one. Have a good one.